Hello everybody, and welcome to session 5 of IBS Relief Now. The topic that I want to cover with you today is really near and dear to my heart. It's at the core not only of what I use when I'm working with people suffering from IBS, but it's really at the core of the work that I do with people presenting with a whole range of different concerns. And that is the issue of how in the world the stressors that people encounter in their day-to-day lives can be transformed into something that helps them to grow healthier and larger lives. That's especially relevant to people suffering from IBS, who in general have this physical problem that presents as a major source of distress, and it really corrodes or erodes their sense of their ability to function comfortably in the many different social roles that they occupy in their day-to-day lives. So learning how to transform stressors into growth opportunities is what we'll be talking about today. In our session today, we're going to be covering 3 main topics. The first is what makes stress stressful. The second has to do with the body's stress response. What is it? What happens when it gets activated too often? And what are the consequences for IBS when people's stress response reaction is activated too frequently? And then the third topic that we'll be covering is this question of whether stress can actually be a positive experience. When can stress actually be good for you? So let's dive right in. To start with, I want to talk about the difference between stress and stressors. A stressor is anything that requires us to adjust and adapt to something. That can be a positive or a negative. Going to the gym and taking a class or lifting weights, that's a stressor because it requires the body to adjust and adapt to the physical demands that are being placed on the body. So that's an example of a positive stressor. And we are pretty familiar with the wide range of things that are negative stressors: worries, confrontations, illnesses, accidents. There are any number of things in the course of our day that we experience as a negative stressor. What about stress? What is stress? The father of stress medicine, Hans Selye, described stress as the rate of wear and tear on the body. The idea is that we're designed to deal with stressors, but we're also designed to deal with them when they come intermittently, giving us the opportunity to deal with the challenge, and then, as we said in a previous session, shift into the parasympathetic mode to go through the process of recharging our batteries, recovering, recouping our energy, repairing any damaged tissues, or repairing the wear and tear that was inflicted or absorbed when facing that stressor. So you can already get a sense that a given stressor becomes a source of stress depending on how we face it. If we learn how to take things that are potential negative stressors and turn them into neutral or positive growth opportunities, we reduce the likelihood that we're going to begin to suffer some of the long-term consequences of chronically high stress levels that Dr. Selye's work helped us understand so much better. There are really 2 different types of stress, one called eustress, EU stress, and the other that we're more familiar with is called distress, DIS stress, something that is experienced negatively. But the reality is, whether it's good or not, in high enough doses, any stressor can be distressing. Any stressor can be negative. The example that comes to my mind are people who are facing wonderful exciting opportunities. Let's say that you have a child who's going to be getting married, or you yourself are going to be married in a number of months. The planning for some of these big, positive, exciting, life-changing events can often be experienced as incredibly distressing. So again, it points us in the direction of recognizing that stressors are, in a sense, packages of experience that are neither positive or negative. It depends on how you perceive it and how you respond to it. And when we learn to respond to it in a more effective and positive way, the wear and tear aspect, the stress aspect, gets reduced. For people suffering from IBS, that becomes a critically important shift, because the way you internalize distress, the way you perceive, and the way that perception translates into arousal patterns in the body is like a direct, as the crow flies line, right into activation of GI distress and IBS symptom patterns. In the end, our stress response system was really designed, as I said earlier, for a world in which most of the time things were relatively calm and peaceful, punctuated by these short-term, almost crisis-like opportunities that we had to gear up for rapidly and then have the time to recover from. Well, that's not a description of modern life, is it? Most of us are dealing with daily hassles, chronic hassles. They may not be at the level of defending our tribe against a saber-toothed tiger attack, but it's that chronic low-grade hassle factor that is so characteristic of modern life, and it is that pattern that is particularly relevant when it comes to what activates and maintains unhealthy activation of IBS symptom patterns. So we really need to learn how to deal with those chronic low-grade hassles in order to be able to free ourselves from operating chronically in that heightened stress response mode, the details of which we'll get into shortly. When we live in the presence of these chronic stressors, what we're doing is operating with a sense of fear. We may not even recognize it as that, but what we're doing is projecting into the future based on what's happening now. We transform something that we're anticipating could go, or might go, or will go a certain way in the future into a present moment experience. So you can think of that pathway, that fear-based IBS activating pathway, as one that transforms future possibilities into present moment inevitabilities. And sure enough, our body reacts to that sense that we are inevitably and imminently facing something negative, and the stress response system is activated right along with GI distress. On the other hand, learning to create a more positive and resilient focus on the future is really about creating a sense of optimism and hope. When we learn to respond that way, we're dealing with future possibilities and transforming them into present moment experiences of passionate persistence and optimism that helps us put one foot in front of the other to persevere in the face of adversity, but with the sense that it's going to be okay. It's going to turn out for the best in the end. Those are two very different outlooks or mindsets that induce a whole series of changes in a negative or in a positive direction in the body and in the brain, including whether or not our digestive system begins to move toward functioning more effectively and comfortably, or remains in this agitated, hyper-reactive, and hyper-aroused state that we call IBS. Let's talk a little bit about what the stress response actually involves. The stress response is like a pre-programmed response pattern that's just sitting ready and waiting to be activated when we perceive something around us is threatening. Now the trouble is that with our advanced mind, we can perceive something as immediately threatening even if it's not likely to happen for 20 more years. In other words, our brain is no longer bound in the way it was in centuries past to what is immediately facing us. We can visualize, we can imagine all sorts of possibilities that may not happen for years or decades or a lifetime, but the experience of that perceived threat is to turn on that stress response system. As soon as it is turned on, several things happen that wreak havoc with our digestive health. The first is that the signal that a threat has been perceived gets sent forward to the area of our brain that sits just behind our forehead. That's where the possible plan of action is first developed. We start conceiving a plan. At the same time, that threat sends a signal to the desire center, the motivation center of the brain, so that we actually have the motivation to take action on the plan that our frontal brain is picturing. And the third place that signal of threat goes is to the motor planning or the movement planning, the behavior planning part of the brain, so that three different things come together. We have the idea or the plan, we have the motivation to carry it out, and the body gets ready to put that motivated plan into action. In order for the body to get involved, what we talked about in a prior session, the autonomic nervous system, has to get activated. That's the system that sends the messaging down into the body to gear it up for action. It does that under the influence of chemicals like adrenaline or cortisol. Now again, those chemicals or hormones are designed to work on a short-term basis, typically measured in minutes. But in modern life, we go to the well way too often, and those hormones continue to course through our blood vessels, having very dysregulating negative effects on many organs in our body, from our heart, our skin, our muscles, but for the purposes of our course, it has a huge negative impact on gut functioning. It throws off the degree to which the gut is active, so digestive processes slow down and become less efficient. It has an effect on the muscles surrounding the gut that are responsible for gut motility, or the rate at which things move through the intestinal tract. So it's functioning less efficiently in terms of extracting energy, and it's operating less efficiently in terms of its actual muscle movement that typically moves things along that 25-foot tube, taking out what we need and preparing the rest to be excreted from the body. It gets even more involved because under the chronic pressure of those stress hormones, we begin to change the chemical nature of what is in the gut. The degree of acidity in the gut changes, which has an effect on the kind of bacteria that thrive under those high stress chemical states, and reduces the number of healthy bacteria that would normally thrive under a different kind of chemical state. So that stress response, when activated, is not just a brain-based activity. It is a whole body activity, with the digestive tract being one of the places where that activity has a very negative impact. That negative impact is for each person that I'm speaking to your particular form of IBS. Now, over time, and I'm talking here about years and decades, when we develop these habitual ways of perceiving our circumstances from a position of fear and worry, from a position of feeling disempowered or invalidated, when we're operating from a position that we don't have a sense of personal control or mastery, we're much more likely to respond to neutral packages of experience that we call stressors in a way that is negatively stressful. And over time, the body's ability to respond with positive and healthy stress reactions gets reduced. Conditions like adrenal fatigue begin to develop so that we start to see chronic fatigue patterns, and that chronic fatigue can show up in muscle achiness, it can show up in mental cloudiness, it can show up with emotional depletion, feeling worn out in our relationships, where we don't feel we have the time or the space or the energy to be able to deal with the people in our lives, even the people in our lives with whom we're very close. So you can start to appreciate, I think, the way learning to respond differently to stressors is part of a much more complex process of learning how to live in cooperation with the world as it is. Learning to perceive stressors as growth opportunities is what we're going to talk about next, because that's such a key skill set when it comes to learning to manage IBS differently. So the next part of this session is designed to answer this question of whether stress can actually be good for you. Now, I remember when I was in college, I used to play soccer, and I remember the day that I broke my leg. I was taken to the hospital, I was put in a walking cast, and I wore that cast for several months. Now, once that cast came off, I still remember looking at how atrophied my calf had become. I really felt at that point, not only wouldn't I ever play soccer again, at that point I wondered whether I would ever walk normally again, because the leg looked so weak and so thin based on a couple of months of inactivity. Well, what did I do to restore the strength of that leg and the muscles of my leg? I had to be walking on it. I had to expose those tissues to the constant push and pull of gravity. I had to stress my leg. And as I did so, not only did the muscles come back, but actually around the area of the bone that broke, the body laid down extra calcium, so that in the end, as that fracture healed, the area that had been injured actually became an area that was stronger than the rest of the surrounding bone. Well, that was a good lesson for me in appreciating that sometimes, if we can learn how to positively stress ourselves, we can actually grow stronger and more resilient, because the truth is, we're not going to go through life without facing many different forms of adversity. So stressors are, as we said before, neutral. They're neither good nor bad most of the time. They're just packages of experience that we have to decide how we're going to perceive, how we're going to interpret, and how we're going to respond to them. Learning to perceive stressors as opportunities for growth is a major foundational assumption that I'm encouraging you to practice developing. When you're facing a stressor, simply stopping and asking yourself, what can I learn here? What is there here that I can discover already begins to transform an experience that may not be pleasant into an experience within which you may extract something that's useful to help you in the future. In the research that I did that went into the book Staying Sharp, we found that people who actively practice that kind of attitude tend to have a host of positive health effects, including longer life expectancy, and longer life expectancy with a report of a higher quality of life. So not only were they living longer, they tended to live longer better. Well, what was the secret of that? They learned to become fearlessly realistic, which is the phrase I use for being optimistic. Fearless realism means I have faced all sorts of adversity. I have been knocked to my knees time and time again, and each time I have learned something from those knockdowns, helping me stand up, be resilient, and feel even more confident that when I face adversity in the future, when I get knocked down in the future, I'll probably be able to get to my feet and keep going forward, having learned something new. That's my sense of what fearless realism means, and why, as someone suffering from IBS, developing that attitude of fearless realism can give you the confidence and the strength to face adversity, even adversity related to how you're feeling in your physical body, in a way that gradually reduces the intensity and the frequency of IBS symptom patterns. At the end of the day, what I'm talking about is really not anything new. You can go back over 2,000 years to the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers called the Stoics, who learned to cooperate with nature as it was. They really cultivated this attitude and mindset that we can live in a world full of negativity, full of adversity, and full of challenge, or based on today's session, full of powerful stressors, and we can thrive in that kind of an environment. They really cemented the idea that in order to know good in life, we have to be able to recognize the bad. If we don't, we tend to live looking at the world through rose-colored glasses or with a Pollyanna-ish attitude, and the research is pretty clear. People who have that kind of an attitude, when they face challenges, tend to give up more quickly and show much reduced resilience. On the other hand, people who have known the negative, learn to live with it, or as the Stoics said, to cooperate with nature, tended to show greater resilience, more positive and longer-term health, and that's the kind of attitude I want to help you cultivate as it relates to diminishing IBS and being able to enlarge your life. To help you be able to turn stressors into opportunities for growth, or to recognize stressors as opportunities for growth, I want to emphasize 3 points that I have taken from the work of Dr. Kelly McGonigal, who wrote a book called The Upside of Stress. The first is when you're facing a situation, including activation of IBS symptoms, it's important to recognize that that response is actually your body making a decision to make energy reserves available to you. In other words, rather than doing what we usually do, which is to shut down the sense of discomfort, try to tamp down the negative feelings that we have, is to recognize that your body is doing its very best in that moment to make energy reserves available to you to deal with whatever it is that you're encountering. So the takeaway is that many of the physical sensations that we experience have to become sensations that we recognize as our friends, as our internal resources. The challenge, of course, is learning how to challenge them in positive directions. But before we can do that, we actually have to recognize that they're a positive resource rather than something to get away from or to work very hard to shut down. That's a principle that is true for anyone experiencing any type of anxiety spectrum difficulty. The more we try and control it, escape it, or shut it down, the more powerful it grows. So learning to befriend the sensations that arise in our body in the face of stress, to recognize them as our body's resources made available to us to deal differently with life, is step one. The second point is that, in general, when stressors are perceived, there is an evolutionary wired-in impulse to seek connection with others. It comes from those times in the long ago past where, when facing a threat, there was safety in numbers. So there actually is an impulse when we're distressed to seek connection. Many of us don't go in that direction because we've learned through our lives that when we're feeling distress, it must be a sign that we've done something wrong or that we've failed in some way. When feelings of stress are accompanied by a sense of embarrassment or even shame, we tend not to seek the comfort and company of others, as though we somehow don't deserve it. So the second step here is that when you're feeling distress, not only are you recognizing that your body is providing you with available energy reserves, but you can ask yourself, who can I turn to? Who can I seek out? Who can I share this experience with so I don't have to face it alone? The more you practice this idea that stressors are invitations to make social connections, the less alone and isolated you feel, and that also has a positive impact on IBS reactivity. Feeling that you're not alone and that you don't have to be alone is very calming and soothing, including calming and soothing to gut reactivity. The third point is that stressors can actually function as positive brain fertilizers. It is under the pressure of stressors that our brain actually is motivated to rewire. As long as we live our lives with routine and predictability and sameness, there's no internal pressure for the brain to come up with new ways of responding, and there's no incentive for the body and for the self to come up with new ways of living. So learning to recognize that stressors are the thing that stimulates the brain, even at the level of a chemical called BDNF. It is secreted in much higher rates that stimulates the nerve networks of the brain to begin to form new connections, denser connections, so that the brain can respond more quickly, more flexibly, and more adaptively. So, allowing ourselves to recognize that stressors are an opportunity to rewire and transform the brain so we can rewire and transform our lives is an important third element in learning to transform stressors into opportunities for positive personal growth. So to summarize here, stressors have that potential to be positive growth opportunities that leaves us with three specific benefits. The first is that seeing stressors as positive opportunities increases our stress hardiness, meaning that we are able to survive and thrive more comfortably and more effectively even in the presence of adversity. The second is when we turn stressors into positive growth opportunities, we begin to decrease the reactivity of the gut. The gut is no longer in this agitated, alarmed state because the body as a whole, including the brain, are saying, we can handle this. This is okay. You don't have to be so reactive. So we begin to reduce gut reactivity. We begin to increase digestive efficiency and effectiveness so that the whole body is moving closer toward that harmony, that state of integration and cooperation that defines good long-term health. And the third benefit is that when we're learning to perceive stressors differently, we are on the road to tamping down IBS symptomatology in ways that are specific to each individual. So we've come to the end of session 5 here. Now I invite you to turn to the guided practice when you're ready to sit down and engage in that practice, and then I'll be back with you soon as we enter into session 6 together. Take care.